Officer Jim forces a hard-working black woman named Edith out of her home on a rainy afternoon, leaving her family homeless in mere minutes. But 8 minutes later, her brutal revenge strikes back, shaking Jim to his core. What truth lies beneath this wrongful eviction, and how far will Edith go to reclaim her home and expose the injustice? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Edith Lawson stood at her kitchen counter, quickly spreading peanut butter on sandwiches while glancing at the clock on the wall. The morning sun streamed through the worn curtains, highlighting the organized chaos of their modest home. Breakfast dishes still sat in the sink, and a pile of ungraded papers waited in her teacher's bag. "Mom, have you seen my science project?" Olivia's voice carried down from upstairs, tinged with panic. "Check under your bed, sweetie," Edith called back, her hands never stopping their practiced motion of making lunches. She could hear Jordan's cartoons playing in the living room, and Isaac's heavy footsteps as he rushed to get ready for his morning classes at the local college. The house wasn't fancy. The paint was chipping in places, and some floorboards creaked, but it was theirs. Every scratch on the walls and worn spot on the carpet held a memory. This was where she'd raised her children alone after losing her husband 5 years ago, where they'd learned to be a family of 4 instead of 5. "Mom, I can finish those," Isaac said, appearing beside her. His kind eyes, so much like his father's, showed concern. "You look tired." Edith smiled, touching his arm gently. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Did you remember to eat?" Before he could answer, Jordan came running in, his superhero pajamas rumpled. "Mom, the TV just went fuzzy again." Edith sighed. Another bill to worry about. She'd have to dip into her carefully managed savings again, money she'd been setting aside for house repairs. Her teacher's salary stretched only so far, even with the extra tutoring sessions she took on after school. "We'll look at it this weekend," she promised, ruffling Jordan's hair. The cable could wait. The leaky bathroom faucet had to come first. Olivia thundered down the stairs, science project in hand, her braids flying. "Found it, Mom, you're amazing." Edith's heart swelled with love for her children, even as she mentally calculated the hours until she could grade papers during her lunch break at school. Between parent-teacher conferences, grocery shopping, and helping with homework, every minute of her day was precious. The morning routine continued its familiar dance, backpacks checked, permission slips signed, and kisses given. As her children headed out the door one by one, Edith paused in the entryway. The house settled into momentary quiet, and she placed her hand on the wall, feeling the solid presence of their home beneath her palm. This house was more than just walls and a roof. It was Saturday morning pancakes and holiday decorations. It was movie nights cuddled on their old couch and birthday celebrations around their scratched dining table. It was the safe harbor she'd fought to create for her children, a promise kept to her late husband that she would always give their family a place to call home. Edith grabbed her teacher's bag, straightened her shoulders, and headed out to face another day. The house might not be perfect, but it was filled with love, and that made all the hard work worth it. Next day, the final bell rang at Jefferson Middle School, and Edith's shoulders sagged with relief. Her head throbbed from a day filled with rowdy students, a surprise classroom observation, and a heated parent meeting about a failing grade. All she wanted was to sink into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea. The drive home felt longer than usual, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. As she turned onto her street, the sight of an unfamiliar car in her driveway made her stomach tighten. A man in a police uniform and a woman in a business suit stood on her front porch. Edith's hands trembled as she parked and stepped out of her car. "Can I help you?" she asked, clutching her teacher's bag close. Officer Jim Mackey cleared his throat, his expression stern. "Mrs. Lawson, I'm Officer Mackey. This is Ms. Roberts from Crown Real Estate." "What's this about?" Edith asked, her mouth going dry. "Ma'am, I'm here to inform you that this property has been sold due to a legal dispute. You'll need to vacate the premises immediately." Officer Mackey's voice was flat, almost bored, as if he was reading a grocery list instead of shattering someone's world. The ground seemed to sway beneath Edith's feet. "That's impossible," she whispered. "There must be some mistake. This is my home. I've lived here for 15 years. I make all my mortgage payments on time. Ms. Roberts stepped forward, holding out a stack of papers. The documentation is all here, Mrs. Lawson. The sale has been processed and finalized. No. Edith shook her head, her voice rising. No, that can't be right. I never received any notice. Nobody contacted me about any legal dispute. This is my home. Her voice cracked on the last word, tears threatening to spill. Ma'am, please don't make this difficult, Officer Mackey said, his hand resting casually on his belt. The law is clear in this situation. Edith's mind raced. Her children would be home soon. What would she tell them? Where would they go? Please, she pleaded. My children. We have nowhere else to go. There has to be some way to fix this. At least give us time to— I'm sorry, but you need to start packing immediately, Ms. Roberts interrupted, her professional smile never wavering. We can give you 24 hours to gather your essential belongings. Edith stared at her front door, at the welcome mat her children had picked out, at the flower pots she'd planted with Olivia just last weekend. This couldn't be happening. It felt like a nightmare, but the unsympathetic faces before her were all too real. Tears streamed down Edith's face as she pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Look, I have all my mortgage statements right here in my banking app. Please, Officer Mackey, just take a moment to check. The officer's face remained impassive. Ma'am, the paperwork has already been processed. There's nothing more to discuss. But this is wrong, Edith's voice cracked. I've raised my children here for 15 years. Every payment, every bill. I can prove it all. Dark clouds gathered overhead as Isaac's car pulled into the driveway. He jumped out, rushing to his mother's side. Mom, what's happening? Before Edith could answer, Officer Mackey stepped forward. You all need to clear out. Now. The first drops of rain began to fall as Edith and Isaac were forced to gather Olivia and Jordan from the neighbor's house where they'd been playing. The children's confused faces turned to fear as they watched Ms. Roberts change their front door locks. Mommy, why are they doing this? Olivia sobbed, clutching her mother's hand. I don't know, baby, Edith whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know. The rain fell harder as they scrambled to grab what they could. Some clothes, important documents, and a few precious photos. Jordan's favorite stuffed bear was left behind in the rush, causing him to wail in despair. They stood on the sidewalk, their meager belongings getting soaked. Edith held her youngest children close, trying to shield them from the rain with her body. Isaac paced back and forth, his fists clenched in helpless anger. Lights came on in neighboring houses. One by one, their neighbors emerged onto their porches, watching in shocked silence. Mrs. Chen from next door approached with umbrellas. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street called out, "This isn't right, they can't do this." But Officer Mackey stood firm, arms crossed, blocking the path to their front door. The rain plastered his uniform to his shoulders, but he seemed unmoved by the family's distress or the gathering crowd of concerned neighbors. Please, Edith tried one last time, her voice barely audible above the rainfall. My children, we've done nothing wrong. Just give us time to sort this out. The law is the law, Mrs. Lawson, Officer Mackey replied coldly. You need to leave the premises now. Olivia buried her face in her mother's side, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. Jordan stood silent, his wide eyes fixed on their front door, now bearing a bright orange "No Trespassing" sign. The rain continued to pour, mixing with their tears as they watched their life being locked away behind familiar walls that had suddenly become forbidden. Isaac's car screeched to a halt at the curb. He leaped out, his college textbooks forgotten in the passenger seat as he rushed to his family huddled in the rain. His heart pounded at the sight of his mother's tear-stained face and his siblings' frightened expressions. What's going on here? His voice was sharp as he stepped between his family and Officer Mackey. You can't just throw people out of their homes without proper notice? Isaac's law school training kicked in. Show me the documentation. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the papers they handed him. Years of studying legal documents had taught him what to look for. These signatures, they're forged. And this notary stamp, it's not even properly registered. Officer Mackey shifted uncomfortably. Listen, son. No, you listen, Isaac cut him off. This is a fraudulent scheme. I've read about cases like this in my law classes. Your agency targets single parents, doesn't it? People you think won't have the resources to fight back. The real estate representative's smile faltered. That's a serious accusation. And I have proof. Isaac pulled out his phone, quickly pulling up his mother's mortgage records. Every payment documented, every piece of paperwork legitimate. You picked the wrong family to scam. He turned to Officer Mackey, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. And you didn't even bother to verify their claims before evicting an innocent family? I'm filing a formal complaint with your department. The rain continued to pour as Isaac's words hung in the air. Despite his confident confrontation, his family remained locked out of their home, their belongings getting soaked on the sidewalk. Olivia clung to Edith's leg while Jordan stared at his shoes, his small shoulders shaking. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer," Isaac declared, though his voice cracked slightly as he looked at his displaced family. "And I promise you, this isn't over." The real estate representative backed away, her confident demeanor crumbling under Isaac's accusations. But the damage was done. The locks were changed, and the Lawson family stood homeless in the rain, victims of a cruel scheme that had targeted them simply because they seemed vulnerable. The rain pelted down harder as Edith scrambled to salvage what she could from the pile of belongings strewn across their front lawn. Her hands trembled as she stuffed photos and important documents into a plastic grocery bag, trying to keep them dry. The family photo album, the one with pictures of the children's father, was already soaked through. "Mommy, my teddy bear is getting wet," Jordan's voice cracked as he hugged his favorite toy to his chest. Edith's heart shattered at the sight of her youngest child's quivering lip. More neighbors emerged from their homes, gathering under umbrellas to witness the scene. Mrs. Peterson from next door rushed over with some garbage bags, while Mr. Rodriguez across the street offered his garage for temporary storage. Their kindness only made Edith's humiliation burn deeper. "Please," she tried one more time, turning to Officer Mackey, who stood stoically under the porch overhang. "We've lived here for 12 years. My children grew up in this house. There must be something you can do." Officer Mackey checked his watch, his expression unchanged. "Ma'am, I've given you plenty of time to collect your things. You need to clear the property." Olivia began to sob, clutching her backpack. "But my room, all my books." Edith pulled her daughter close, fighting back her own tears. She had promised her children they would always have a home, that she would always protect them. Now here they stood in the rain, their lives reduced to a pile of wet boxes and bags. What kind of mother was she? She had failed them completely. "Mom?" Isaac touched her shoulder gently. "The Rodriguezes said we can stay with them tonight." She nodded numbly, watching as neighbors helped gather their belongings. The Christmas ornaments the children had made in school, Jordan's first baseball trophy, the growth chart marked on the kitchen doorframe. Everything that made their house a home was being packed away or left behind. "Officer?" Edith made one final appeal, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter has a math test tomorrow. Could we just stay until morning?" Officer Mackey's response was cold. "If you're not off this property in 5 minutes, I'll have no choice but to remove you forcibly." He turned away, speaking into his radio about his next assignment, as if he wasn't watching a family's world crumble before him. Edith's shoulders sagged under the weight of defeat. Around her, her children's faces reflected confusion and fear, emotions no mother ever wants to see in her children's eyes. She had always taught them to be strong, to face challenges head-on, but right now she felt anything but strong. She felt small, helpless, and utterly broken. That afternoon, Officer Mackey shrugged off his rain-soaked jacket as he entered the police station, his mind already moving on to his next assignment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he made his way to his desk, ready to file the paperwork for what he considered just another routine eviction. "Mackey!" Captain Roberts' voice boomed across the station. "My office. Now!" The sharp tone in his superior's voice made Mackey pause. He turned to see Captain Roberts standing in his doorway, face stern and arms crossed. Several other officers glanced up from their desks, then quickly looked away. Inside the captain's office, Mackey stood at attention, watching as Roberts closed the door with deliberate slowness. The captain's desk was covered with papers, and on top of them sat a familiar-looking eviction notice. Would you care to explain why you conducted an eviction without proper verification of the documentation? Captain Roberts' voice was dangerously quiet. Mackey shifted his weight. Sir, the real estate representative had all the necessary paperwork. All the necessary paperwork? Roberts cut him off. Did you actually check those documents? Did you verify them with the county clerk's office? Did you even bother to look at the dates on those papers? Mackey's voice trailed off as an uncomfortable feeling began to settle in his stomach. You threw a family out of their home without doing your due diligence, officer. Roberts leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. A single mother and 3 children, Mackey. In the rain. And now we're getting calls from neighbors, local news, and housing rights advocates. The captain picked up the eviction notice and waved it in front of Mackey's face. This paperwork is full of inconsistencies that you would have caught if you'd taken 5 minutes to review it properly. 5 minutes, Mackey. Mackey felt his face grow hot. Sir, I don't want to hear excuses. Roberts cut him off again. This kind of negligence is exactly what gives our department a bad name. You're lucky if we don't face a lawsuit over this. The captain sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. Consider this your final warning, Mackey. One more mistake like this and you'll be turning in your badge. Now get out of my office and fix this mess. As Mackey walked back to his desk, his colleagues' sideways glances felt like accusations. He slumped into his chair, the image of those kids standing in the rain starting to creep into his mind. But he pushed it away, telling himself he was just following procedure. Still, something about the captain's words nagged at him, making him feel increasingly uneasy about what he'd done. The Rodriguez from next door offered their guest house, a small but comfortable space behind their main home. As Edith carried boxes through the drizzling rain, each step felt heavier than the last. The guest house was nothing like their home with its cramped rooms and unfamiliar smell, but at least they had a roof over their heads. Mom, where should I put Olivia's stuffed animals? Jordan asked, his small arms wrapped around a box nearly as big as he was. Edith's voice caught in her throat. Just put them anywhere for now, sweetheart. She watched as her youngest children tried to make sense of their new surroundings. Olivia sat quietly in a corner, clutching her favorite teddy bear, while Jordan methodically unpacked his action figures, lining them up as if trying to create some order in their chaos. The sight of their few belongings scattered across the floor made Edith's chest tighten. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She'd worked so hard to give her children stability after their father passed away. The mortgage payments, the careful budgeting, the extra tutoring jobs, it had all been for them, to keep them safe and secure. Her hands trembled as she tried to unpack a box of kitchen items. A coffee mug slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor. The sound seemed to break something inside her too, and suddenly she was crying, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Mom? Isaac's voice came from behind her. He'd been bringing in the last of their boxes when he found her kneeling among the broken pieces. I'm sorry, she whispered, wiping her eyes. I failed them, Isaac. I failed all of you. Isaac knelt beside her, his face determined. No, Mom, you didn't fail anyone. Those people who took our home, they're the ones who failed. They failed to be honest, failed to be decent human beings. He helped her up, his grip gentle but firm. We're going to fight this, Mom. I've already started researching similar cases. What they did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal, and we're going to prove it. Edith looked at her eldest son, seeing so much of his father in his strong jaw and steady gaze. But what if... No what ifs, Isaac interrupted. We're getting our home back, and we're going to make sure these people can't do this to anyone else. His words, spoken with such conviction, gave Edith something to hold on to. She squeezed his hand, managing a small smile through her tears. Even in this tiny guest house with their world turned upside down, they still had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to get them through this. The local news van pulled up outside the Rodriguez's house the next morning. Edith watched through the guest house window as reporters set up their equipment, her stomach churning with anxiety. Mrs. Lawson? A gentle knock accompanied the reporter's voice. We'd like to hear your story. Isaac stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his mother's shoulder. "Mom, this could help us. The more people who know about what happened, the harder it'll be for them to get away with it." Edith smoothed her worn cotton blouse, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't planned on becoming a public figure. She was just a teacher who wanted her home back. But as she looked at her children's faces, she knew Isaac was right. The interview aired that evening on the local news. Within hours, social media exploded with shares of Edith's story. The image of a single mother and her children forced out of their home struck a chord with viewers across the city. "Mom, look at this," Isaac said, showing her his laptop screen. 3 other families came forward. They all dealt with the same agency, the same tactics. His eyes blazed with determination as he scrolled through the messages. They forged documents, created fake legal disputes. It's all part of a pattern. Edith leaned over his shoulder, reading the stories that mirrored her own. Single parents, elderly homeowners, all targeted because the agency thought they wouldn't fight back. "There's more," Isaac continued, pulling up another window. "I found records of properties they've flipped in the last year. The numbers don't add up. They're selling houses they don't legally own." The phone rang. Another news station wanting an interview. Edith stared at it, then at the growing pile of evidence on Isaac's laptop. She thought about all the other families who'd lost their homes, about her own children sleeping in a borrowed guest house. "Isaac," she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I want to fight this. Not just for us, but for everyone they've hurt." Isaac smiled, already reaching for his legal notepad. "I've been waiting for you to say that, Mom. I've got the names of 3 lawyers who specialize in real estate fraud." Edith straightened her shoulders, feeling a new sense of purpose replace her fear. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was going to stand up and fight for her home, for her children, and for every family who'd been wronged by this agency's greed. Next day, Officer Jim Mackey sat at his desk, the captain's harsh words still ringing in his ears. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he opened Edith Lawson's case file, spreading the documents across his cluttered desk. Something didn't feel right. He picked up the property deed the real estate agency had submitted. The paper felt too crisp, too new for a document that was supposed to be over a decade old. Jim rubbed his tired eyes and pulled up the county records database on his computer. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing the dates. The ownership transfer documents showed impossible timelines, dates that didn't match, signatures that appeared in different styles. His stomach tightened as he discovered more inconsistencies. The image of Edith standing in the rain with her children flashed through his mind. He remembered how he'd dismissed her protests, hadn't even bothered to double-check the paperwork properly. He'd been so sure of himself, so convinced that following orders meant doing his job right. Jim pushed back from his desk and walked to the break room, his coffee cup shaking slightly in his hand. The guilt sat heavy in his chest as he poured himself a fresh cup. Other officers chatted nearby, but their voices seemed distant as his mind replayed the scene. The younger kids crying, the neighbors watching, the look of devastation on Edith's face. Back at his desk, Jim dug deeper into the real estate agency's history. Each new piece of information made him feel worse. Multiple complaints had been filed against them in neighboring counties. Similar patterns emerged. Single parents, elderly homeowners, all losing their homes through suspicious legal proceedings. "I should have checked," he whispered to himself, running his hands through his graying hair. "I should have listened." The weight of his mistake pressed down on him. He wasn't just dealing with paperwork anymore. He was dealing with real people, a family he'd helped throw out of their home. His arrogance had made him a tool in someone else's scheme. Jim pulled out a legal pad and began taking careful notes, documenting every inconsistency he found. It wouldn't fix what he'd done, but maybe it could help make things right. The defensive wall he'd built around his actions began to crumble as he faced the truth. He'd failed not just as an officer, but as a human being. That late afternoon, Officer Mackey's police cruiser rolled to a stop outside Edith's neighbor house where the Lawson family was staying. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he gathered his courage. The manila folder full of evidence sat heavy on the passenger seat beside him. The walk to their temporary room felt like the longest of his life. Each step made his heart beat faster as he approached the door marked. He knocked softly, then waited, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Edith opened the door, and her warm expression immediately cooled when she saw him. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of sleepless nights, and Jim felt another wave of shame wash over him. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "May I please come in? I need to speak with you." Edith hesitated but stepped aside, letting him enter the cramped motel room. Isaac sat at a small table in the corner, his textbooks spread out before him, his jaw clenched at the sight of Officer Mackey. "I owe you both an apology," Jim began, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed you. I failed to do my job properly, and your family has suffered because of it." He opened the folder, laying out the documents he'd discovered. "I should have verified these documents. I should have listened to you when you tried to explain." Edith sat on the edge of one of the beds, her hands folded in her lap. The younger children were at school, but their presence lingered in the scattered toys and clothing around the room. "I was arrogant," Jim continued, looking directly at Edith. "I acted without proper investigation, without showing basic human decency. There's no excuse for what I did, but I want you to know that I'm here to help make this right." Isaac stood up from his chair. "Now you want to help after we've lost everything?" "Isaac," Edith said softly, placing a hand on her son's arm. She turned to Officer Mackey, her eyes studying his face. "Why should we trust you now?" Jim's shoulders sagged under the weight of her question. "You shouldn't," he admitted. "I haven't earned your trust. But I've found evidence of the real estate agency's fraud. Multiple cases, all following the same pattern." He gestured to the papers he'd brought. "I'm willing to testify, to help you fight this in any way I can." The room fell silent. Edith looked at the documents, then back at Officer Mackey's face. She saw something different there now, not the cold indifference from before, but genuine remorse. "I understand if you can't forgive me," Jim said quietly, "but please, let me help make this right." Officer Mackey pulled up a chair at the small table, spreading out the documents he'd brought. His police badge caught the dim light of the motel room lamp as he leaned forward. "Look here," he said, pointing to a pattern of dates and signatures. "The agency has been targeting single parents and elderly homeowners across 3 counties. They forge documents, create fake legal disputes, and then push for quick evictions before anyone can verify the paperwork." Isaac crossed his arms, still standing protectively near his mother. "We already knew they were corrupt." "Yes, but what you don't know is how to fight them within the system," Jim replied patiently. "I've spent 15 years in law enforcement. I know which judges to approach, which departments to contact, and, most importantly, how to fast-track your case." Edith moved closer to the table, her eyes scanning the papers. "How exactly would this work?" "First, we file an emergency injunction," Officer Mackey explained, pulling out a blank form from his folder. "I know Judge Martinez personally. She handles housing disputes and takes fraud very seriously. With my testimony about the agency's pattern of behavior, we can get your case prioritized." Isaac's stance softened slightly as he listened. "And you'd really testify against them?" "Without hesitation," Jim nodded firmly. "What I did was wrong, and I need to make it right. Not just for your family, but for everyone else they've hurt." Edith watched Officer Mackey carefully, noting how different he seemed from the cold, dismissive man who had evicted them. His eyes were earnest now, his voice gentle and determined. "I believe him," she said quietly, touching Isaac's arm. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right." Isaac sighed, finally pulling up a chair. "Fine, but I'm watching every move you make." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Officer Mackey replied with a small smile. He pulled out more papers, explaining each step they would need to take. "We'll need to document everything, your original mortgage papers, proof of payments, even testimonies from your neighbors who witnessed the eviction." As they worked through the details, Edith felt a glimmer of hope rising in her chest. Having a police officer on their side, especially one who understood the system's inner workings, could make all the difference in their fight to reclaim their home. Isaac and Officer Mackey sat in Jim's patrol car, reviewing a list of addresses on a worn notepad. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dashboard as they pulled up to their third interview of the day. "This one's the Martinez family," Officer Mackey said, his voice heavy. "Evicted 4 months ago. Same agency, same tactics." They walked up to a small apartment building, where Maria Martinez welcomed them into her cramped one-bedroom apartment. Her 3 children played quietly in the corner, surrounded by boxes that had never been unpacked. "We used to have a house," Maria explained, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. 3 bedrooms, a backyard. We'd lived there for 8 years when they came with the papers. Isaac took careful notes while Officer Mackey asked specific questions about dates and documents. The pattern was becoming clearer with each interview. Back at Edith's temporary housing that evening, they spread their findings across the kitchen table. Edith listened intently as they shared the stories they'd collected. 7 families in the past 6 months, Isaac said, arranging the photos they'd gathered. All single parents or elderly homeowners, all given less than 24 hours notice before eviction. Edith picked up one of the photos, an elderly man standing in front of his former home. Her hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Chen lost the house he'd lived in for 30 years, she said softly. "The house where his children grew up." Officer Mackey nodded grimly. "The agency specifically targets people they think won't have the resources to fight back. They count on fear and confusion to push people out quickly." As Edith looked at the faces in the photos, tired, worried but determined, she felt something shift inside her. Her own pain and exhaustion were still there, but they were joined by something stronger, a sense of purpose. "These people need help," she said, straightening her shoulders. "We're not just fighting for our home anymore. We're fighting for all of them." Isaac reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. "We've got statements from 5 families already willing to testify. With Officer Mackey's evidence and their testimonies, we can show it's not just a series of mistakes," Officer Mackey finished. "It's a deliberate pattern of fraud." The 3 of them continued working late into the evening, organizing evidence and connecting the dots between cases. Each story they uncovered added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the full scope of the agency's deception. What had started as one family's fight for justice was growing into something much larger, a chance to help others who had been wronged and prevent future families from facing the same devastation. Isaac spread the documents across District Attorney Sarah Chen's desk. Bank records, forged signatures, and testimonies from 7 different families. His hands were steady, but his heart raced as he watched her examine each piece of evidence. "This is compelling," D.A. Chen said, adjusting her glasses. "The pattern is clear. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and illegal evictions." Back at their temporary housing, Edith sat at the kitchen table helping Jordan with his math homework, while Olivia practiced piano on a small electronic keyboard their neighbors had loaned them. The familiar routine felt strange in the unfamiliar space. "Mommy, when are we going home?" Jordan asked, looking up from his multiplication tables. Edith's throat tightened. "We're working on it, sweetheart," she managed, running her fingers through his hair. "Right now, we need to focus on these math problems." Later that evening, after putting the younger children to bed, Edith stood at the window of their borrowed apartment. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her shoulders. Their savings were dwindling, and the thought of permanently losing their home kept her awake most nights. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, holding a covered dish of still-warm enchiladas. "You need to eat," she said firmly, pressing the dish into Edith's hands. "We're all behind you, Kirita." The support of her neighbors had been overwhelming. They donated furniture, helped with childcare, and even started a community fund to help with legal expenses. Their kindness brought tears to Edith's eyes. The next morning, local news stations began reporting on the investigation into the real estate agency. Isaac had worked with Officer Mackey to ensure the story reached the media. Photos of families standing in front of their stolen homes flashed across screens throughout the city. The agency's phone lines were flooded with calls. Their pristine office, usually quiet and professional, buzzed with nervous energy as employees whispered about possible arrests and impending charges. "Mom," Isaac called excitedly, bursting through the door that evening. The DA is moving forward with the case. They're filing criminal charges against the agency's executives tomorrow morning. Edith nodded, trying to smile through her exhaustion. While part of her felt relief at the progress, another part feared hoping too much. She'd learned how quickly everything could be taken away. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. "What if we can't get our home back?" Isaac wrapped his arms around his mother, holding her tight. "We've got the whole community behind us now," he said, "and the truth is finally coming out. That's what matters." Officer Mackey sat at his desk poring over files late into the night. His dedication to exposing the real estate agency's fraud had become personal. With each new document he uncovered, each connection he made, the weight of his initial mistake pressed harder on his conscience. "Look at this," he said to Isaac, who had stopped by the station. 3 more cases from last year. Same pattern, same forged signatures." He spread the files across his desk, pointing to highlighted sections. They specifically targeted single parents and elderly homeowners. Isaac leaned in, his eyes scanning the documents. "This is exactly what we need." Meanwhile, Edith's story had caught fire across local news stations. Her quiet dignity and determination resonated with viewers, and soon larger networks picked up the story. She found herself being interviewed on morning shows, sharing her experience with sympathetic hosts who called her brave and inspirational. "You're giving hope to so many families," one reporter told her after an interview. But the attention brought its own challenges. Walking to her car after school one day, Edith noticed angry messages scrawled on sticky notes stuck to her windshield. "Stop lying," one read. "You're ruining good people's lives," said another. That evening, as she deleted another batch of hostile emails, Olivia climbed into her lap. "My friend Katie said her dad works at the real estate place," she said quietly. "She's not talking to me anymore." Edith held her daughter close, fighting back tears. The simple dream of providing a stable home for her children had somehow thrust her into a spotlight she never wanted. Officer Mackey noticed her distress during their next meeting. "The agency has friends in high places," he explained, his voice gentle. "They're trying to pressure you into backing down." "I just want our home back," Edith said, her voice tired. "I never meant to become the face of anything." But Officer Mackey wasn't deterred. He worked overtime, coordinating with other precincts to identify more victims. His fellow officers, impressed by his dedication to righting his wrong, began offering their help. Together, they built a comprehensive map of the agency's fraudulent activities across 3 counties. Local support groups for single parents began rallying around Edith's cause. They organized peaceful protests outside the real estate agency's offices, sharing their own stories of housing discrimination and fraud. What had started as one family's fight was becoming a movement. Through it all, Officer Mackey remained steadfast in his support, using his badge and position to push the investigation forward. He made sure every threat was documented, every lead followed, every piece of evidence properly processed. His determination to make things right had transformed him from an unwitting accomplice in their eviction to one of their strongest allies. The real estate agency's legal team called an emergency hearing, presenting a thick folder of documents to the judge. Among them was a contract, yellowed with age, but bearing what appeared to be Edith's signature. The paper claimed she had agreed to surrender her property rights 5 years ago in exchange for reduced mortgage payments. Edith stared at the signature, her hands trembling. "That's not possible," she whispered to Isaac, who sat beside her in the courthouse. "I would never sign something like that." The agency's lawyer spoke with practiced confidence. "As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Lawson willingly entered into this agreement. We have witnesses who can testify to her presence at the signing." Officer Mackey, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watched as the color drained from Edith's face. The documents looked authentic, proper letterhead, notary stamps, even coffee stains that gave them an air of authenticity. "The court will need time to verify these new documents," the judge announced, shuffling through the papers. "All proceedings will be suspended until we can determine their legitimacy." Back at their temporary housing, Edith sat at the kitchen table, her shoulders slumped. The small apartment felt suffocating compared to their home. Jordan's toys were piled in corners, and Olivia's school projects covered the refrigerator. attempts to make this place feel like home that only highlighted what they'd lost. "They're lying!" Isaac paced the small living room, his fists clenched. "Those documents are fake. They have to be." He kicked a chair, making Olivia jump from where she was doing homework. "Isaac," Edith said softly but firmly, "please." "No, Mom. We've worked too hard. Officer Mackey helped us find all those other cases. We have proof of what they've been doing to other families. And now they just waltz in with some made-up papers and everyone believes them?" Edith pressed her hands against her temples, fighting back tears. The weight of it all, the public attention, the hostile messages, the strain on her children, and now this felt overwhelming. Everything they'd built over the past few weeks seemed to be crumbling. Officer Mackey called later that evening. "I'm so sorry, Edith," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "The documents look legitimate. They even have proper watermarks from that time period. The agency must have spent a fortune getting these forged." "What do we do now?" Edith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Officer Mackey admitted. "The whole case is frozen until these documents can be verified, and that could take weeks." Isaac slammed his laptop shut, where he'd been reviewing their evidence for the 100th time. All their momentum, all their progress, had come to a crushing halt. The real estate agency had played their hand perfectly, using the very legal system Isaac had put his faith in to stop them in their tracks. The days following the hearing dragged by like heavy weights. "Maybe we should start looking for a new place," she said one evening, her voice hollow as she stirred a pot of soup she barely had the energy to make. "Something more permanent than this apartment." Isaac looked up sharply from his laptop. "Mom, no, we can't give up now." "I'm not giving up," Edith said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just being realistic. The kids need stability. We can't keep living like this, waiting for something that might never happen." Officer Mackey visited regularly, bringing coffee and updates from his own investigations. Today, he sat at their cramped kitchen table, his police badge catching the afternoon light. "The forensics team is still analyzing those documents," he said, watching Edith's tired movements. "We'll find something. Papers this detailed usually leave traces when they're forged." But Edith barely nodded, her shoulders slumped as she mechanically packed lunches for Olivia and Jordan. The spark that had driven her to fight was flickering, dimmed by exhaustion and disappointment. Isaac refused to let the momentum die. Every evening after his classes, he pored over legal documents and made calls to other victims of the agency. His determination seemed to grow stronger as his mother's faded. "We have too much evidence of their other schemes," he insisted, spreading papers across the table. "These forged documents can't hold up forever." Officer Mackey stayed late most nights, helping Isaac organize their findings and offering whatever support he could. He saw the toll this was taking on Edith, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she talked about their home, the forced smile she put on for her younger children. "You're stronger than you think, Edith," Officer Mackey told her one evening, after watching her struggle through another day. "What you're feeling is normal, but don't let them win by wearing you down." Edith managed a weak smile, but her eyes remained distant. She still went through the motions, attending meetings with lawyers, reviewing documents when Isaac asked, maintaining a brave face for Olivia and Jordan. But the fire that had fueled their initial fight was barely more than embers now. Yet even in her deepest moments of doubt, she never completely surrendered hope. She still kept their home's spare key on her keyring, still carefully wrapped their family photos in tissue paper rather than hanging them in the temporary apartment, still refused to sign any permanent lease agreements. It was as if some small part of her couldn't fully let go, even as the rest of her struggled to keep believing in their cause. The doorbell rang just as Edith was folding another load of laundry in their temporary apartment. She almost didn't answer it, too drained by the constant stream of well-meaning neighbors and reporters. But something made her get up from the couch. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a smartly dressed young woman whose smile was hauntingly familiar. "Mrs. Lawson?" The woman's eyes were bright with emotion. "I'm Caroline Mitchell. I was in your 8th grade class about 15 years ago. Edith's hand flew to her mouth. Caroline? Little Caroline who used to stay after class for extra help? Caroline nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The same one. Though not so little anymore. She gestured to her briefcase and professional attire. I'm an attorney now, and I've been following your story in the news. Edith's legs felt weak. She steadied herself against the doorframe as memories flooded back of a struggling student who'd sit in the front row, determined to understand every lesson despite her difficulties. Please come in, Edith managed, leading Caroline to their small living room where case files and papers were scattered everywhere. Caroline took in the sight of their temporary home, her jaw tightening. I've been keeping track of your case, Mrs. Lawson. What that agency did to you, it's unconscionable. We've been trying to fight, Edith said softly, sinking into the couch. But they're so powerful in these new documents they've produced. That's why I'm here. Caroline set her briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with purpose. I want to help. I specialize in fraud cases now, and I've dealt with similar schemes before. Edith shook her head. We can't afford… No, Caroline interrupted gently, reaching out to take Edith's hand. You don't understand. I'm not here to charge you anything. I'm here to repay a debt. What debt? Mrs. Lawson, do you remember all those afternoons you spent with me after school? How you never gave up on me, even when everyone else had? Caroline's voice cracked with emotion. You were the first person who made me believe I could be more than what others expected. You're the reason I made it through school, through college, through law school. Tears spilled down Edith's cheeks as Caroline squeezed her hand. Let me help you now, Caroline said firmly. Let me use everything I've learned to fight for you, the way you once fought for me. For the first time in weeks, Edith felt a spark of real hope ignite in her chest. She looked at her former student, now a confident, capable professional, and saw more than just legal help. She saw a reminder of why she'd become a teacher in the first place, and why some battles were worth fighting. Caroline settled into their makeshift command center, the small dining room of the temporary apartment. Papers and folders covered every inch of the table as she, Isaac, and Officer Mackey pored over the evidence they'd gathered. These signatures, Caroline said, holding up 2 documents side by side, they're clearly forged. Look at the variation in the strokes here and here. She pointed to specific spots that showed inconsistencies. Isaac leaned in, his eyes narrowing. That's what I thought too, but the agency's lawyers kept dismissing our claims. They won't be able to dismiss a forensic handwriting expert, Caroline replied, making a note in her legal pad. I know someone who specializes in document authentication. Officer Mackey cleared his throat. I've been doing some digging through police records. Found 3 more cases from last year with similar patterns. Single parents, sudden evictions, falsified paperwork. Perfect, Caroline nodded. That establishes a pattern of behavior. Have you been able to contact any of these families? 2 of them agreed to testify, Officer Mackey said, sliding over a folder. They're scared, but they want justice too. From the kitchen, Edith watched them work together. Her heart swelled with pride seeing Isaac matching Caroline's legal knowledge point for point. Even Officer Mackey, who had once been their adversary, was now fully committed to their cause. Mrs. Lawson, Caroline called out, noticing her former teacher hovering nearby. Could you come look at something? Edith joined them at the table. Caroline spread out several documents, including the mortgage papers Edith had signed years ago. Tell me about the day you signed these, Caroline requested gently. As Edith recounted the details, Caroline took careful notes, occasionally exchanging meaningful glances with Isaac. When Edith finished, Caroline's smile was confident. This is exactly what we needed, she said. Your consistent recollection of events, combined with the original documentation we've found, completely contradicts their fabricated timeline. You really think we can win? Edith asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. I know we can, Caroline assured her. The evidence is mounting, and with Officer Mackey's testimony about proper eviction procedures being ignored, she gestured to the police officer, who nodded firmly. We're going to make this right, Mom, Isaac added, reaching for her hand. Edith squeezed his hand back, looking around at her unlikely team, her determined son, her reformed officer, and her former student who had become such a capable advocate. For the first time since losing their home, she felt truly confident that justice would prevail. Caroline and Isaac spent long hours interviewing victims of the real estate agency's scam. They sat in coffee shops, living rooms, and community centers, listening to story after story that mirrored Edith's experience. "It happened so fast," a tearful mother of 4 told them. "One day I was making dinner in my kitchen, the next day we were out on the street." Isaac carefully documented each testimony while Caroline asked precise questions about dates, documents, and interactions with the agency. Each new account strengthened their case and revealed more about how the scam operated. They targeted single parents specifically, Isaac noted, reviewing his notes. Always families who seemed vulnerable but had built up equity in their homes. Caroline nodded grimly. They counted on people being too overwhelmed to fight back. Meanwhile, Edith found unexpected support from her school community. Her fellow teachers organized a meal train, ensuring her family had hot dinners every night. Parents of her students dropped off gift cards and care packages. Even her students made cards with encouraging messages. "We're here for you, Mrs. Lawson," one card read in careful, childish handwriting. "You're the best teacher ever." Mrs. Chen from next door brought homemade dumplings every Sunday. Mr. Santos, who lived across the street, offered his pickup truck whenever they needed to move things. "Your fight is our fight," Mrs. Chen said firmly, patting Edith's hand. "We won't let them destroy our community." Back at their makeshift office, Caroline worked with a forensic document expert who meticulously analyzed the agency's paperwork. Under specialized lighting and magnification, the forgeries became clear. Inconsistent ink ages, paper from different batches, signatures that didn't match Edith's known writing patterns. "Look at this," the expert pointed out. "The document they claim is from 2015 uses a type of security paper that wasn't manufactured until 2018. Isaac added this evidence to their growing file. "They got sloppy," he said. "They never expected anyone to look this closely." The community's support gave Edith strength during the difficult days. When doubt crept in, someone always seemed to appear with a kind word or helping hand. Her younger children, Olivia and Jordan, found stability in this network of care, their anxiety easing as they saw how many people stood with their family. "Mom," Olivia said one evening, "my friend Emma's mom says you're teaching everyone how to be brave." Edith hugged her daughter close, drawing comfort from these simple words. The fight wasn't just about their house anymore. It had become about standing up against injustice, about showing her children and her community that ordinary people could stand up to powerful wrongdoers. After a few days, the courtroom buzzed with tension as Caroline stood before Judge Martinez, her shoulders squared and her voice steady. Edith sat in the front row, clutching Isaac's hand, her heart pounding as she watched her former student prepare to present their case. "Your Honor," Caroline began, "what we have here is not just one isolated incident of fraud, but a calculated scheme targeting vulnerable families across our community." She moved with purpose, laying out document after document on the evidence table. The forensic expert's findings were displayed on a large screen, showing the discrepancies in the forged paperwork. "As you can see," Caroline pointed to specific details, "the security paper used in these supposedly old documents wasn't even manufactured until years after the dates claimed by the agency." The real estate agency's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Their CEO, Mr. Patterson, sat with a stony expression as Caroline methodically dismantled their defense. "Furthermore," Caroline continued, gesturing to a stack of folders, "we have testimonies from 12 other families who experienced identical fraudulent evictions. The pattern is clear and deliberate." She called their forensic expert to the stand, who explained in simple terms how the forgeries were detected. The judge leaned forward, clearly engaged as the expert pointed out inconsistencies in ink age and paper quality. "And here," Caroline said, presenting another piece of evidence, "are the original property records showing Mrs. Lawson's consistent mortgage payments over the past decade." The agency's lawyer attempted to object, But his arguments grew weaker with each piece of evidence Caroline presented. Mr. Patterson's face had turned pale, and he whispered urgently to his legal team. "Your Honor," Caroline's voice rang clear and confident, "these documents prove beyond doubt that the real estate agency fabricated this entire transaction. They created false papers, forged signatures, and deliberately targeted Mrs. Lawson and other single parents, believing they wouldn't have the resources to fight back." The courtroom fell silent as Caroline displayed surveillance footage showing agency employees backdating documents. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust. "This isn't just about property rights," Caroline said, her voice filled with conviction. "This is about protecting our community from those who would prey on hard-working families." As Caroline continued presenting their evidence, Edith watched the agency's defense team growing more desperate. Their carefully constructed scheme was falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. Officer Mackey, sitting nearby, nodded in satisfaction as each new piece of evidence further exposed the truth he had failed to see on that rainy day. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as Caroline laid out the final pieces of evidence: bank records showing the agency's pattern of fraudulent transactions, emails discussing their targeting strategy, and testimony from a former employee who had quit in disgust. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, the courtroom falling into a hushed silence. Edith's fingers tightened around Isaac's hand as they waited for the verdict. "Having reviewed all the evidence presented," the judge began, his voice firm and clear, "this court finds in favor of Mrs. Edith Lawson." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tears welled up in Edith's eyes as the judge continued. The real estate agency's actions were not only fraudulent, but demonstrated a calculated pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families. I hereby order the immediate restoration of Mrs. Lawson's property rights and full return of her home. Caroline squeezed Edith's shoulder gently as the judge detailed the compensation. Furthermore, the agency is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $250,000 to compensate for the emotional distress, temporary housing costs, and other damages suffered by the Lawson family. 2 police officers entered the courtroom, moving toward Ms. Roberts and her associates. The judge's voice grew stern as he addressed the agency's leadership. "Given the extensive evidence of criminal activity, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Ms. Roberts and her executive team on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering." The officers began handcuffing Ms. Roberts, who had finally lost her composed facade. Her face had turned ashen as the reality of his situation sank in. Edith couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She wrapped her arms around Isaac, who was beaming with pride and relief. Behind them, Officer Mackey wiped at his eyes, touched by the justice finally being served. The courtroom erupted in applause as supporters, other victims, and community members celebrated the verdict. Little Jordan and Olivia, who had been sitting quietly with a neighbor, rushed forward to embrace their mother. "We can go home, Mommy?" Olivia asked, her eyes bright with hope. Edith nodded, gathering her children close. "Yes, sweetheart. We can finally go home." Caroline turned to Edith, her own eyes glistening. "Justice has been served, Mrs. Lawson. Your home is yours again, and these people won't be able to hurt any more families." As the handcuffed executives were led away, the judge's gavel rang out one final time, bringing the historic case to a close. The victory wasn't just for Edith. It was a triumph for all the families who had suffered at the hands of the corrupt agency. In the days following the court victory, Edith sat in her familiar kitchen, running her fingers along the worn wooden table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room she'd feared she might never see again. The house felt different now, not just a shelter but a symbol of justice and perseverance. She thought about the long months of struggle, the nights spent in temporary housing, and the countless moments of doubt that had plagued her. But those memories were now softened by the knowledge that they had emerged stronger, their family bonds tested but unbroken. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Officer Mackey stood on her porch, not in his usual uniform but in casual clothes. His face carried a mixture of humility and peace she hadn't seen before. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, fidgeting with an envelope in his hands. "I wanted to share something with you." Edith invited him in, pouring 2 cups of coffee as they sat at the kitchen table. Officer Mackey placed his resignation letter on the table between them. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," he explained, his voice soft but certain. "About how I almost helped destroy your family's life because I didn't take the time to look deeper, to question what I was told." Edith watched him carefully as he continued. "I'm leaving the force," he said. "I've realized I can do more good working directly with communities, helping prevent what almost happened to you from happening to others." Tears welled up in Edith's eyes as she listened to him describe his plans to start a community advocacy group focused on housing rights and fraud prevention. "Jim," she said, using his first name for the first time, "you've already shown what kind of person you truly are. You could have walked away after realizing your mistake, but you chose to stay and fight alongside us." Officer Mackey's eyes glistened. "I'll never forget how you gave me a chance to make things right, even after what I did." "That's what forgiveness looks like," Edith replied, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "You've earned it, not just through words, but through your actions." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how far they'd come from that rainy day when he'd stood on her porch with an eviction notice. The journey had changed them both, Edith into a stronger advocate for justice, and Jim Mackey from a disconnected officer into someone determined to make a real difference in people's lives. The news of the real estate agency's shutdown spread quickly through the community. Headlines in the local paper declared, "Fraudulent housing scheme exposed, new protections enacted." The agency's offices stood empty now, with official notices plastered across their windows, a visible reminder of justice served. At the community center, Edith sat beside Caroline as they watched the mayor sign new housing protection legislation. The Lawson Act, as it had come to be known, would require stricter verification processes and create a special task force to investigate potential housing fraud cases. "This wouldn't have happened without you, Mrs. Lawson," Caroline whispered, squeezing her former teacher's hand. Edith felt overwhelmed as she looked around the packed room. Families who had faced similar struggles sat in the audience, many of them wiping away tears as the mayor described the new protections being put in place. The law would require multiple verification steps before any eviction could proceed and establish an emergency housing assistance program for families facing fraudulent claims. "Thanks to Mrs. Lawson's courage," the mayor announced, "vulnerable homeowners across our city will now have the protection they deserve. Her fight has become everyone's victory." The community had organized a celebration in the park near Edith's home. Neighbors brought food and strung up colorful banners between the trees. Children played on the grass while their parents shared stories of how Edith's case had given them hope in their own housing struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly neighbor who had supported Edith throughout her ordeal, approached with tears in her eyes. "You showed us all what it means to stand up for what's right," she said, embracing Edith. "Because of you, my daughter just got her house back too." Isaac stood proudly beside his mother as more people came forward to share their stories. Some had already benefited from the new protections, while others expressed relief knowing they now had safeguards in place. The atmosphere was filled with joy and gratitude, a stark contrast to the dark days when Edith had stood in the rain watching her world fall apart. A representative from the Housing Rights Coalition approached Edith with a plaque. "Your case has become a blueprint for housing protection reform," she explained. "We're already seeing other cities adopt similar measures. You've started something much bigger than you know." Edith held the plaque in her trembling hands, reading the inscription that honored her resilience and dedication to justice. Around her, the community continued to celebrate, their voices filled with hope and determination. Her personal struggle had transformed into a movement, bringing positive change to countless families facing similar challenges. Edith stood on her front porch, keys clutched tightly in her hand. The familiar weight of them felt different now, more precious, more meaningful. Behind her, Isaac carried boxes while Olivia and Jordan raced past, eager to reclaim their bedrooms. "Home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she turned the key in the lock. The house had been empty for weeks, but somehow it felt warmer, more welcoming than ever before. Neighbors streamed in through the open door, carrying casseroles, flowers, and welcome home gifts. The kitchen quickly filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking dishes as everyone worked together to prepare for the celebration. Mrs. Rodriguez arranged flowers in Edith's favorite vase, while Caroline helped set up folding tables in the backyard. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled the air as dish after dish arrived, comfort food made with love and relief. "Mom, look what everyone brought," Jordan called out, pointing to the growing spread of food on the kitchen counter. Edith watched as her children moved through the house with renewed appreciation for their home. Olivia had already pinned her artwork back on her bedroom wall, while Isaac organized the living room, making sure everything was exactly as his mother had always kept it. As the sun began to set, the backyard glowed with strings of lights that neighbors had hung between the trees. Jim arrived with his family, carrying a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Lawsons." The awkwardness of their past had dissolved into genuine friendship. "I never thought losing our home would lead to gaining such a bigger family," Edith said to Caroline, watching as more people gathered in her backyard. The tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes and children played tag between the adults' legs. Isaac stood up, tapping his glass for attention. "I'd like to propose a toast to my mom," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "She taught us that standing up for what's right isn't just about fighting for yourself. It's about fighting for everyone who needs a voice." Tears welled in Edith's eyes as she looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors. Each person there had played a part in their journey back home, whether through legal help, emotional support, or simply being there when hope seemed lost. The evening air filled with stories of triumph and gratitude. Other families shared how the new housing protections had already helped them, while children played freely, unaware of the adult conversations but feeling the joy that permeated the gathering. As Edith sat surrounded by her children and community, she felt a deep sense of peace. Their home wasn't just a building anymore. It had become a symbol of perseverance, of justice, and of the power of standing together against wrongdoing. The struggle had taught her that forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds, and that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to admit their mistakes. If you enjoyed the story of Edith and Officer Jim Mackey, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.